Hello and welcome to Lecture 7 and today we will be talking about the tragedy of the commons. So just a quick reminder what we were talking about in the previous lectures. So we introduced this notion of externalities. So externalities are where you have benefits or costs associated with some economic activity which aren't borne by the producer or the consumer. And the idea that these externalities are a considerable source of unsustainable resource use. So they either lead to the overuse of resource in the case of a negative externality because you're not paying the full costs for the resources that you're consuming, or under provision of valuable goods and services in the case of positive externalities because people aren't being compensated for the services which they're provided. And this is the case when you have services which don't have market prices associated with them. These externalities are often related to common pool resource or open access resource management. You can see this to some extent if you think about the fish bank scheme, and I'll talk about that in more detail. But more importantly, I would say that it's not only the kind of externalities that impact the unsustainable use of common pool resources. And so what I'm going to try and do in this lecture is talk through a bit about open ocean fisheries as an example of common pool resources, and sort of mixed with that a little bit discussion about the fish bank simulation that we played last week, and some of the underpinning assumptions of those models, and finally talk a little bit about well, I guess three notions related to the commons. So Garrett Harding's notion of the tragedy of the commons, and then Mancourt's notion of collective action problems, and finally a little bit about Eleanor Ostrom and her kind of socio-ecological systems framework for managing common pool resources. So this is sort of a bit like a fish banks debrief from last week. In the actual seminar, we'll go through the data from the fish bank simulation. I can't do that now because I'm recording this before we've done the simulation. But just to give you some general idea about the fish banks. So consider the Atlantic cod. So this is a long-lived, slow-maturing fish. The long-lived and slow-maturing matters in terms of fishing because it means that there's potentially a feedback lag between you taking fish out of the ocean and you noticing a change in the ocean, change in the fish stocks, because you take a non-mature fish out and you don't realise until 20 years later when that fish would have been mature and would produce new young fish. So this was once an immensely abundant stock of fish, so ecological resource if you want to frame it in that way. John Cabot, when he was exploring Newfoundland off the eastern coast of Canada in the end of the 14th century, noted that fish stocks were so thick that they practically blocked his ship. People talked about being able to walk across harbours because the fish numbers were so dense. And up to the 1950s, a harvest in the Newfoundland fisheries was something like 250,000 metric tons per year. And fishing in these open ocean fisheries followed this kind of prevailing mental model of unlimited abundance. So this is Thomas Henry Huxley, who was referred to as Darwin's bulldog, and he was a kind of naturalist, and he said probably all the greatest fisheries are inexhaustible. That is to say, there's nothing we do which seriously affects the number of fish. Well, that wasn't quite right. So this is an estimate of the biomass of cod stocks in the Scotian Shelf, so Nova Scotia, basically, again in Canada, with the estimated biomass in 1852, and then its decline until when we actually started accurately measuring these things. So when accurately maybe isn't even the right word, but deliberately measuring cod biomass in the 1970s, and you can see there was this massive decline from something like 1.2 million metric tons to less than 200,000 metric tons, and we've been managing in this kind of highly degraded fish stocks since the 1970s, and it's only really been getting worse since then. This is an interesting phenomenon which I'm not sure I'll talk about elsewhere, so maybe I'll just mention it here. This is part of this problem is something sometimes called the shifting baseline problem. That now when we're trying to manage fish stocks, for example, we're trying to manage them based on the information we started collecting in the 1970s. So if we get back to this, it will be seen as an impressive feat in terms of restoring the ecological capacity of this open ocean fishery, but actually probably we should be thinking about this as a baseline figure of where those fish stocks could be. So here's a couple of quotes from people. This is from the New England fishery, so still on the east coast of North America, but in the US now. I remember catching 5,000 pounds of fish in 8 nets, so that's about 2,500 kilograms, so 2.5 tons. Today it might take up to 80 nets. Back then the average codfish in the spring would probably be 20 to 40 pounds, now it's 5 to 8 pounds. This is a fisherman basically saying this. Now again, coming back to why this 5 to 8 pounds versus 25 to 40 pounds matters, because that means that in this fisheries now, people are catching these immature fish. So the fish aren't maturing enough in order for them to be able to reproduce. So this is fundamentally a problem. This is another quote. Going down from the dock to the docks and talk to the guys down there, said John Nelson, the chief of the Marine Fisheries Division. Most of them have their boats for sale. If they could sell their boats and do something else, they would. And this is fundamentally a problem. So you have whole communities who are locked into fishing as a livelihood, and when the fish stocks collapse, they have no other kind of means of income, and so they still continue to try and catch fish. So they have 80 nets now and catch small fish, but this never allows the fish stocks to recover. So this is kind of sometimes in socio-ecological systems thinking called a locked-in trap, that you've locked yourself into this over-exploitation of resources, and it's very difficult for you to get back out of this dynamic. So these are non-trivial problems in terms of human well-being. World capture fisheries are about 90 million tons a year. So that capture fisheries means it excludes fish farming, for example. So this is actually people going out into the oceans and catching fish, with a value in 2008 of $94 billion. The fish sector employs 45 million people directly and 180 million people indirectly, and supports about 540 million people. So almost 10% of the world's population, 8% of the world's population is supported by these open ocean fisheries. So losing them fundamentally will have an impact on human well-being and major ecological impacts as well. And more than 3 billion people get 15% or more of their animal protein from fish. So this is also an important source of nutrition for many people in the world. It's estimated that only 15% of fish stocks worldwide are underexploited or moderately exploited. That's down from 40%. And that means that all the other fish stocks, so 85% of fish stocks, are overexploited or extremely overexploited. So this is the kind of patterns. I'm going to show you a few examples here of the kind of patterns that you see when you look at biomass or fish stocks for different fish species and in different oceans. So this is in the Atlantic, and this is swordfish. 1950s, weren't catching much, went up and up and up, and then in the 1990s, those fish stocks started to collapse. For Pacific bluefin tuna, the numbers went up and up and up, and then they collapsed. Remember, this is an example we had in an earlier lecture about this bluefin tuna selling for 1 million euros in the market in Tokyo. So massive increase in fishing followed by collapse. Here we have herring, and this is now in Maine, and again increase. Let me find my mouse. Increase followed by collapse and moderate recovery, I would say. This is an interesting example because this is now looking at herring in a different area in North America. But what's interesting here is they began to count herring stocks in the 1960s. They saw the numbers were collapsing. So in 1993, they banned fishing in Cherry Point. Then they created a aquatic reserve, and then they tried to petition the government to make herring an endangered species. That failed, but all these kind of attempts to manage that fisheries didn't work, and the numbers continue to decline. There's a couple of reasons why that is. So there's still the locked-in trap problem that we had before, that people still want to go out and catch those fish, but there's also complex ecological relationships here. So it might be that once you take the majority of the herring out of this ecological system, other species move in and fill that ecological niche, and then there's no possibility for those fish stocks to recover. Well, that because there is simply not the same ecosystem in which they used to thrive. So, and I'm guessing, although I don't know for certain, that similar dynamics were found in our simulation of the fish tank of the fish banks game. So the catch went up and then it collapsed and didn't really recover. And this is a pervasive pattern that we see in open ocean fisheries called overshoot and collapse. So ideally, we'd want to maintain the fish catch at some sustainable level over time. So why doesn't that happen? So there's this figure we've sort of had before in the fish bank simulation. So you have net recruitment here on the y-axis and fish density on the x-axis. And again, just to reiterate, if you have very few fish in the sea, you get very few new additional fish in the sea. As the number of fish stock increases, so does the amount of new fish per year, until you reach some point here at which there's competition for resources, and therefore more fish in the ocean means that you get a smaller increase in additional fish each year, until you reach the carrying capacity of the ocean effectively, and then no more fish can kind of live there. So the maximum kind of stock density, and the maximum sustainable yield is taking the maximum number of fish per year without diminishing the total fish stock. And this is kind of this point here. The problem is you can catch more fish and make more short-term profit by moving beyond this point. Well, there's a number of problems. One is you don't necessarily know where this maximum sustainable yield point is. You need to have good information about the ecology of the system to know that. Also, the maximum sustainable yield is going to change year to year. So much as in the fish banks game, where you have this variable, this random variable of weather, there are random variations in fish stocks or kind of other things which are impacting fish stocks. So what might be a sustainable yield in one year might not be in the second year or another year. More importantly, I guess, once you move past this point of the maximum sustainable yield, now you're starting to degrade your fish stock. So you're consuming more fish than are being recruited in the ocean, but you can't make a distinction between new fish which are being generated sustainably from a kind of fixed and stable stock and fish which are being taken from that stock. And this is fundamentally a problem, but you've invested more and more infrastructure, more boats, more money into catching more fish, and it's very difficult to move backwards. So once you start to see your fish stocks decline, you have to decrease your fishing effort even more rapidly, and that's very difficult to do because you're locked into this system of fishing as a means of livelihood. So this is again this notion of a locked-in trap even. Then there are other factors which matter here. So pre-industrial fishing, people went out on boats with small nets and caught small amounts of fish. Now, and this is actually a very small modern net, people go out with huge fishing trawlers and can catch massive amounts of fish in one time. And that's not just a question of the ease at which you can catch fish now. It's also a question of how quickly the feedback comes between diminishing fish stocks and diminishing fish catches. So when you're reliant on this relatively simple technology, if your fish stocks decline, you tend to notice quite quickly and you can respond to that. But with modern technology where you have sonars and GPS and spotter planes and remote sensing and all this type of stuff, if you can't catch fish where you used to because you've declined or diminish those fish stocks, you can simply go deeper into the ocean or catch different sorts of fish or go further out to sea. And so the point at which your fish catch actually declines is much later than the problem actually occurs. And so technology, as beneficial as it has been in many ways, for example, making fishing a safer and less arduous task than it used to be, it also creates these lags in feedbacks about when problems occur. And you can see that, so this is often called fishing down the food chain. You can see from this figure in the 1950s that the fish stocks were rapidly declining, so 39% decline by 1980 and 87% decline by 2006. And so when those fish which were easy to catch at the surface were diminished, people simply fished deeper into the oceans and caught other sorts of fish. And then in terms of employment, so technology means that now you have bigger and bigger kind of ships catching more and more of the fish, but employing less and less people. So the productivity increases, but the employment doesn't increase. And we'll come to that issue later in the semester when we start to talk about things like technological unemployment and steady state economics. So again, this is the point I was already making about the impact of technology on ship effectiveness. So when you have low technology and your stock of fish starts to decline, you notice that relatively rapidly, and in theory you can put in preventative measures to stop that decline continuing. But for high technology, then you tend not to notice the decline as quickly, and you're locked into that trap, and then you have this dynamic which is difficult to escape. So we know in general how to prevent overshoot. So you need early and effective signal of resource depletion and system health. Again, one of the things I would say is you cannot get that from just counting how many fish are caught on your boat each year. So that doesn't tell you whether you're taking a sustainable harvest of new net recruitment of fish or you're diminishing your fish stock. So you need independent, serious scientific effort to assess the stock levels and the ecosystem health and the emergent threats. And you have to do this in partnership with kind of the resource appropriators and the communities related to that, those resource appropriators. The reason you need to do it in partnership with these people is that if you want to change people's behaviours, then you need to have some kind of agreement. So often what we'll see, not just in open ocean fisheries, but in other natural resource management systems, is you have the scientists on one side saying stop fishing, and the kind of communities that appropriate those fishing resources, so the fishing companies and the individual fishers, saying you're trying to destroy our livelihood. So there's a tension between the two. So you need some kind of transdisciplinary generation of knowledge in order that there's a shared understanding of what the problems are and how to deal with them. And it's, as I said, it's not just fisheries you see that, you also see similar kind of tensions between conservation organizations and farmers, for example, where there is no shared understanding about how the situation is. So having that early effective signal is what you need, but it's difficult because resource levels are often unobservable. How do you count how many fish there are in the Pacific? Harvest is not a reliable indicator of the stock levels, we already mentioned that. There's natural variability, meaning that the safe harvest is often less than the maximum sustainable yield. So in other words, you can calculate what you think the maximum sustainable yield is, and then you tell the fishers that they have to actually catch less than that, and that also creates tension. And it's difficult to build and maintain trust among scientists, regulators, appropriators, communities and other stakeholders, particularly in the face of a resource which is threatened. So if you're already struggling to pay your bills and kind of provide food for your family, and then someone tells you you should do even less fishing, this creates kind of more tensions. So the second thing you need to do to prevent these overshoots is that harvest must be limited to regeneration. So in other words, you cannot harvest more than the kind of natural new flow of fish which are generated in the oceans. It's difficult because these are common pool resources. That means they are non-excludable, or it's difficult to exclude people from them. That makes enforcement difficult, and it can also be expensive. How do you stop people going out into the ocean and catching fish? Again, regeneration rates are uncertain, they're variable and they're difficult to assess. And then in order for you to rebuild fish stocks when they've already been depleted, you have to let the harvest fall even more rapidly in order to allow regeneration to occur. So again, going back to, let's find the figure I want. I should have put a copy of it in. Oh, too far. To here, you know, if you've come down to a fishing density here, the amount of new fish you get each year is only here. You know the maximum sustainable yield is here. You actually have to fish at less than this in order to have actually a new increase in fish density and to eventually get back to this kind of ideal fish stock. So I'm using my finger instead of the mouse, so I'll try that again. So in other words, say your fish density has declined to here, you can actually only, even though your net recruitment is at this level, you probably only want to catch this many fish so that the fish density actually increases until you get to your maximum sustainable yield. So if the limit is set too high in terms of how much you can fish, then the system will eventually collapse. But the science is often opposed by fishery interests. There are delays or preventions in implementation. There's political pressure leads to catch limits which are set too high. Catch limits can lag stock assessments, and then there's kind of normal ecological variability can tip the system into collapse. So you could go a little bit over the maximum sustainable yield, and that already creates this feedback dynamic. And then shifting baselines we've already talked about. So this is an example of kind of some of the challenges related to managing these open access resources, which aren't necessarily related explicitly to externalities. And I wanted to also just mention a little bit about the kind of scientific approach to thinking about some of these problems, particularly in terms of systems thinking. So generally, a lot of science has traditionally been based on this notion of reductionism. So you've got this whole complex reality which you're trying to understand, and you do that by splitting it into smaller component parts and understanding those in details. By understanding the smaller parts in details, then you should be able to, if you understand all the smaller parts, you should be able to understand the system as a whole. This is basically the principle by which a huge amount of kind of scientific progress has occurred, but it's not without its problems. So sometimes it's actually difficult to understand the whole of the system by understanding just its component parts in detail. And so systems thinking is the approach to science which seeks to actually understand the whole system in a holistic way rather than understand small parts of the system in detail. And I would argue that it's a complement to kind of this reductionist approach to science. It also is strongly related to kind of understanding system dynamics. So a lot of science is based on taking snapshot views of the world, and systems thinking is much more about kind of the dynamic relationships between different parts of systems. So it's an important part of sustainability science. It's can be thought of as an analytical method for kind of modeling the world, but for more fundamentally it's a way of seeing the world. So it's about seeing the world as a set of interconnected nodes and feedbacks and emergent properties and self-organization and complexity, which have to be embraced rather than understood by removing complexity by making things into small discrete units. and it's particularly useful for modeling system dynamics and system change. So dealing with a kind of dynamic system like open ocean fisheries and system dynamic modeling is quite useful. There's many different approaches to systems thinking. Here's, if you're interested in this, you can look at the works of people like Peter Checkland or Donella Meadows. Peter Zenger is another kind of leading thinker on these things, and they come from quite different perspectives. So Peter Zenger comes from a kind of organization business perspective. Then you can think about people who are looking at kind of social change. You can look at systems thinking from a kind of system science perspective, or from kind of ecological modeling. There's all these different approaches which all take this systems approach. So generally when we're talking about systems, then we're thinking about elements, the interactions between those elements, and the function. So a system is made up of a number of elements, the interactions between those elements, and it does something. So this is a pretty simple example of a bath. So you have a water faucet, a water tap, and then you have the bathtub, and then you have a drain. And those are the three elements, and they're interconnected by water flows. And you can see a kind of simple system schema for this. So you have an inflow via the tap, the water fills up, and the outflow from the drain. And you can manage the level of water in the bath by changing these two elements. So generally, a system has identifiable parts. The parts affect each other. Together they produce a different outcome than each part on its own. And usually you'd expect some kind of persistent function or behavior over time in a variety of situations. So it doesn't matter if it's cold outside, unless it's super cold, you can still pour water in, it'll still go out in the drain. It doesn't matter who's doing the pouring, that system still works in the same way. A lot of this is based on stocks and flows. So stock is accumulation of material or information that's built up over time, and a flow is in and outflows of materials and information that change those stocks. And so you can think of this, the bathtub as an example. There's a stock of water in the bathtub and there are inflows and outflows, but you can also think about the kind of precipitation, so evaporation and transpiration, solar energy, and these kind of stocks of water in the lake, and the flows between evaporation and rainfall in kind of sophisticated ways. We'll come back to stock and flows again when we talk about more ecological economic perspectives later in the semester, because they're important for things like understanding ecosystem services and also understanding some things like critical natural capital and strong and weak sustainability. So we'll come back to some of these things. One of the important things about systems thinking is that it often isn't based on this notion of linear causality. So linear causality is basically the idea that you have a causal chain of cause and effect. In other words, someone does thing A, that leads to thing B, that leads to thing C, and that leads to thing D. So there's a kind of a clear root cause of the event, a chain of causal reactions, and then the outcome that you're interested in. So systems thinking is much more based on this notion of causal loops, so emergent behavior. And there's no single directionality or causality by a single event, but rather the outcome of the system, the behavior of the system, is an emergent behavior based on the kind of interactions between the different elements in that system. So kind of A affects B, affects C, affects D, and B affects D, affects E, affects C, but the outcome is the kind of interaction between all these things. There's no starting point in that system. So there's a strong focus on the kind of nodes as states, kind of an element. So the node, for example, is in this causal loop type modeling would be the amount of water in the bath, and the feedbacks or the change in states between different nodes. And you can generally think about two types of feedbacks which can occur. So the first is amplifying feedback or reinforcing feedback that leads to instability or expansion, or a balancing or dampening feedback which leads to self-correction. So this is a very simple model, a restaurant occupation model. And again, with these causal loops, you can start anywhere, but let's just start here. So new customers arrive at outside a restaurant. They see that the tables are occupied, so they think, oh, this must be a good restaurant to eat in, and therefore they choose to eat there. That means that there are more tables occupied, that increased perception of the quality of the restaurant means new customers stay, and then you have this reinforcing feedback loop. But then, of course, you have balancing feedback loops. So at some point, the amount of people sitting at the tables means that new customers go, well, now I'm going to have to wait a long time in order to get some food, and therefore the new customers don't stay. And so that's a balancing feedback loop. And similarly, there's only a certain amount of customers you might have. So once lots of customers are already in the restaurant, there's less available new customers to come. So you get another balancing feedback loop. And so a lot of this system dynamic model is based on this principle of understanding those kind of amplifying or dampening feedbacks between different components in the system. And I won't go through this in detail, but this is essentially the system dynamic model, the causal loop model, which is used in the Fishbanks game. Actually, mainly only this bit is modeled in the game. This bit comes from, this bit is also modeled in the game. In fact, this bit comes from you as the players. But again, you can kind of see that there's let's find a good starting point. There's a reinforcing feedback loop at some point. Fish stocks increase, that means population growth increases, that means net recruitment increases and the total amount of fish increases. But as the fish density increases in the ocean, the amount of fish you catch increases, and that means you catch more fish, which is pushing the fish stock back this way. So that's a balancing feedback loop. And then there are limits to growth. So this is once the fish density reaches a certain level, that the amount of new net recruitment decreases, so the amount of fish stock growth slows down. And then you can also relate it to things like technology, which we've talked about. This is basically what happens from your perspective in the game. So as a fish catch increases, that increases your revenue, increases your profits. It means you want to buy more ships. You buy more ships, that increases the catch, which pushes the fish stock back. So there's a reinforcing feedback loop here. There's a balancing feedback loop in terms of total costs and profits at some point, and so on. And you can spread that wider, so you can think about what this means in terms of the fish price on the market, which the game doesn't model, or the simulation doesn't model, and then how the amount of fish caught affects things like population growth and wealth. So you can expand these models. They're super useful ways of thinking about these kind of complex system dynamics that we have to manage to sustainably manage open access common pool resources. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the tragedy of the commons, and I guess probably this is something you already know a little bit about. This is quite a common idea in the literature, and we'll talk about this in more detail in the seminar because I think it's an interesting one to talk about. So Garrett Harding came up with this notion of the tragedy of the commons in the end of the 1960s. This is a quote from his paper: "Ruin is the destination towards which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in the commons brings ruin to all." So first thing we notice, of course, it's super sexist language. The other thing which became clear later on is that Garrett Harding wasn't simply sexist, but he was also super racist. We'll talk about this in more detail in the seminar, so I won't go into it here. But basically, Harding's idea was that you start off with a common pool resource. In this case, grazed land is below the carrying capacity of the land. So all users benefit from having animals on that land. And then it makes sense that if you're benefiting from this land as a private individual, you put one more sheep onto that land, because all the benefits you get from having that sheep accrue to you, and the ecological degradation is shared among all users. So you get all the benefits and you only get a fraction of the cost. And if it's logical, rational for you as an individual to behave in that way, it's logical for other people to behave in that way. And so each individual acting in their own rational self-interest, assuming again that we're rational, self-interested utility maximizers, and everyone increases their stock of sheep on the field, and that ends to degradation. At some point the ecological system collapses, and everyone is harmed by that outcome. And we kind of see this thing, at least the outcome, in terms of things like overgrazing in communal pasture land, overfishing, climate change could be seen as an example of that. So I get all the benefits from burning a ton of fossil fuels in my car, if I had a car, and the costs are spread among 7 billion people, so I keep doing it. Population growth has been suggested another example, deforestation, non-renewable resource use, these type of things. So again, it comes back to this notion, the tragedy of the commons as a common pool resource problem, when it's non-excludable but rival. And you see examples of these common pool resources like pastures, open ocean fisheries, forests, irrigation systems. And you can also see them to some extent in open access resources, which are non-reliable, non-excludable and non-rival. So the atmosphere is a waste sink, potentially resilience, potentially babies. So the kind of open access resources is a bit interesting, so maybe I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So if it's non-rival, how does it mean that you can overuse that resource? Because me using it doesn't stop someone else using it. Well, in the case of the atmosphere, for example, me putting a ton of carbon into the atmosphere doesn't stop you putting a ton of carbon into the atmosphere. But by doing that, I'm actually diminishing the quality of that kind of system in order to provide a stable climate. So if you think of it, it's non-rival in terms of using it as a waste sink, but it is rival in terms of using it as a means of maintaining a carbon balance and therefore a stable climate. So Harding himself came up with these two solutions for managing the tragedy of the commons. Privatization, so you internalize the externality. So in other words, if the problem is that rationally a common owned resource will be over used, then you simply don't make it a commonly owned resource. You make it into a private resource which is owned by clearly defined individuals, and then all the benefits of using that resource flow to those individuals, but so do all the costs. So in other words, if you start degrading your pasture land, then you'll stop because you're feeling the costs of that degradation. So we must admit that our legal system of private property plus inheritance is unjust, but we put up with it because we're not convinced at the moment that anyone has a better system. The alternative of the commons is too horrifying to contemplate. Injustice is preferable to total ruin. So property is theft, but theft is better than ruin, basically, he was saying there. But the other argument that that Harding made was that you could have mutual coercion mutually agreed upon. But that he somehow dismissed this notion, and given the kind of political desire for private property and for profit maximization and these sort of things, it was really this notion of privatizing the commons was seen as a solution to this problem, this notion of the tragedy of the commons. There are limits to privatization, so it requires effective rule of law to enforce property rights, and there are these huge conflicts around, which even Harding acknowledged, about who should have those property rights in the first place. And then there's some things where it's difficult to actually make it into a private property. So how do you make the air or the atmosphere into a private good which people have ownership of? And then there are some systems where private ownership doesn't work well, such as non-equilibrium rangelands. So maybe I just give you, how are we doing for time? A quick example of that. So common pool resources are fundamentally tragic, according to Harding. So if you go to the rangelands in southern Africa, for example, what you should do is put fences around small plots of grazing land and let farmers own those grazing land. They'll maintain the kind of stocking density of livestock at a rate at which they're not degrading that resource if they're rational. Fine in theory, and actually works quite well in kind of these stable ecological systems like in North America and Northern Europe, because the productivity of your 2 hectares of land is more or less the same every year. And this is sort of where the racism starts to come into Harding's worldview, I would argue, that he went and looked at kind of communal grazing land in Africa, for example, and said, oh look, this land is all brown and degraded, and it must be because these stupid people don't know how to manage their resources, or they're trying to manage it as a common pool resource rather than use the same solution we have in the global north as kind of private property rights. But the fact is, non-equilibrium systems, and when we talk about non-equilibrium systems, we mean that the amount of productivity in that system is highly variable year from year. So some years you have good rainfall, some years you have poor rainfall, some years the systems are very productive and some years not so productive. Having these small patches of land which are privately managed is problematic, because one year your 20 sheep is perfectly fine in terms of the biomass productivity in those 2 hectares, but then you have a bad year, all your sheep die because there's no food. And that's why these common grazing systems emerge, because if you have a large area which is commonly managed or commonly owned, then if one area is not productive in a given year because there's been no rainfall, you simply shift all of the animals to an area which is more productive and allow that system to recover, and then you can go back and regraze that system later. So there were very good reasons why common pool management was a solution for grazing in Africa, which didn't necessarily work in the global north. And to say that this was a problem of the tragedies rather than a solution to a non-equilibrium rangeland issue is just super racist. So then, thinking about this notion of mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, then probably the most important thinker about this was Elinor Ostrom. She was a winner of the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. Unfortunately, she died a few years ago, and she did a huge amount of work looking at these common pool resource use systems around the world and trying to understand how they can be sustainably managed. So basically what she did, she looked at 300 or 400 different case studies of relatively small community-based resource management systems which were based on kind of common ownership. And she came up with kind of 8 design principles for governing those commons. So one, you need clearly defined boundaries. So you should be able to effectively exclude external entities from kind of entering into that common pool resource system. You need rules adapted to local conditions. So how to manage that system is quite context dependent, and those rules need to be generated locally. But when you're thinking about how to manage that system, the people who appropriate resources in that system have to be involved in the decision making process, because if they're not, they don't kind of accept the legitimacy of those rules. Then you need effective and independent monitoring available. So you need to have this external monitoring to kind of see how well the system's been managed. And you need to have graduated sanctions available to punish appropriators who break those rules. So in other words, if we go back to our fish banks game, you'd need to have some way of punishing the people who are kind of overfishing, even if you were trying to be sustainable in your use of that resource. You need to have conflict resolution mechanisms, because conflict is almost certainly going to occur in these systems. And then you need to have this kind of multi-level governance where the self-determination of the community itself is recognised by these higher level authorities. And for large-scale common pool resources, you need to have this organisation occur at multiple levels of nested enterprises, because it's difficult. Again, this comes back a bit to this notion of costs and transaction costs. If you have an open ocean fisheries which is being kind of resources being appropriated by 100,000 people or 2 million people, you can't have 2 million people sit together and set those rules. So you need to kind of break up that system into manageable kind of nested enterprises with kind of local organisation, but then coordination at the regional level, at the national level, at the global level, whatever it might be. So I'm not going to go into much more detail about the work of Eleanor Ostrom, but if you're interested in managing these common pool resources, it's a very good place to start. And she does have a whole body of literature about managing socio-ecological systems and thinking about resource appropriators and resource units and kind of how to appropriately design rules for those systems. But the last point I really want to make is just something quickly about changing the framing. So here we have Garrett Harding. So he framed the problem as one of being the tragedy of the commons, that common ownership is fundamentally a problem, that only private property allows for sustainable resource use. So the problem is common ownership. Manko Olsen instead talked about collective action problems, where the problem isn't common ownership itself, but the problem is how to coordinate action for the common good. And hopefully we'll talk more about this in the seminar, but for me that's a fundamentally different way of understanding the world. If you understand the commons as being the problem, then you have to get rid of the commons. But many things are managed or exist as commons for very good reasons. And if you see the problem more as how to have good collective action, then it completely reframes the way you think about how to effectively or sustainably manage those resources. So, just summing up, tragedies do occur in common pool resource and open access resource systems. However, the framing of the tragedy of the commons and the type of solutions that it engenders are potentially highly problematic, and this we'll talk about more. So next week we start to talk in more detail about this notion of ecosystem services and what it means, how it's used, and these type of issues. And what we'll discuss in the seminar in week 7 is, well, we'll go through the outputs from the simulation from week 6, and then we'll talk about what went wrong with the Fishbanks game and why, how else could we have played to win, what would winning really look like from a sustainability perspective, and is there really a tragedy of the commons? So these are the kind of things that we're going to discuss in week 7, and I hope to see you there. Bye.